The morning light filtered through the yellowed curtains of the McAllister farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Annie pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching dust devils dance across the Nebraska prairie. At 24, she had long accepted her place as the plain sister, the one whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of years spent in fields and kitchens rather than parlors and social calls. "Annie, get down here this instant!" Her father's voice thundered up the narrow staircase, sharp as a whip crack. She smoothed her faded calico dress and descended, each step measured and careful. In the kitchen, her mother sat rigid at the table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her father, Thomas McAllister, stood near the cast-iron stove, his face darker than storm clouds. And there was Evelyn, her younger sister, sobbing prettily into a lace handkerchief. Even in distress, Evelyn was beautiful golden hair catching the light, porcelain skin unmarred by sun or labor, blue eyes swimming with tears that somehow made them sparkle more. "Tell her," Thomas commanded, his voice cold as January wind. Evelyn's sobs intensified. "I can't marry him, Annie. I simply can't. A rancher in Wyoming territory, living in some hovel in the wilderness. I'd rather die." Annie's stomach dropped as understanding dawned. For 6 months, Evelyn had exchanged letters with a rancher named Jesse Hartland, responding to his advertisement for a mail-order bride. The family had celebrated when he'd sent money for her passage west. It meant one less mouth to feed and a respectable marriage for their beautiful daughter. "You gave your word," their mother Margaret said quietly, but her eyes held sympathy for her favorite child. "I was confused. I didn't know what I was agreeing to," Evelyn wailed. "Besides, Samuel Morrison has been calling on me. He owns the general store. I could stay here near civilization, near family." "Enough!" Thomas slammed his fist on the table. "You took that man's money. You made promises. This family's reputation. Then let Annie go." The words fell from Evelyn's lips like stones into still water. Silence. Annie felt every eye turn to her. "What?" she whispered. Evelyn straightened, her tears miraculously ceasing. "Mr. Hartland has never seen me. We've only exchanged letters and that one photograph, the one where you can barely make out features. Annie could go in my place. She's more suited to that kind of life anyway." Annie's chest tightened. More suited, because she was plain, because she was already worn down by work, because no one in town would offer for her anyway. "That's dishonest," Annie said, finding her voice. "Is it?" Thomas studied her with calculating eyes. "You're both McAllister daughters. He advertised for a bride, and he'll get one. Besides," his lips curved in a cruel smile, "what prospects do you have here? You think any man's going to court you when your sister's available?" The truth of it stung worse than any slap. Annie had watched men's eyes slide past her to Evelyn for years. She'd served refreshments at socials while Evelyn danced. She'd minded the farm while Evelyn attended church picnics and barn raisings. "I won't lie to him," Annie said firmly. "Then tell him the truth when you arrive," Thomas shrugged. "Let him decide. But you'll go, girl. You'll honor this family's commitment." "Father, please." "It's decided." He turned to leave, then paused. "You leave Thursday morning. Better start packing what little you own." The 2 days passed in a blur. Their mother helped her pack, folding Annie's few dresses, all practical, all mended multiple times, into a small trunk. She added her mother's Bible, some preserved food for the journey, and basic necessities. Evelyn avoided her entirely, though Annie heard her laughing with friends on Tuesday afternoon, already recovered from her crisis. That night, Annie found the letters from Jesse Hartland hidden in her room, placed there by Evelyn. She read them by candlelight, trying to glimpse the man she was being sent to. His handwriting was careful, educated. He wrote of his ranch, 200 acres in Wyoming territory, of cattle and horses, of mountains that touched the sky. He wrote of loneliness, too, though he tried to hide it between descriptions of daily life. He was 31, a veteran of the war, had built his home with his own hands. He wanted a partner, someone strong enough for frontier life, but gentle enough to make a house a home. Annie touched the letters gently. He'd written to Evelyn, praised her photograph, imagined her in his home. What would he think when plain, work-worn Annie stepped off that coach? Thursday dawned gray and bitter. The family gathered at the coach station, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Other travelers bustled about. A minister heading to Colorado, a family relocating to California, two rough-looking men who kept to themselves. "Remember," Thomas said, pulling Annie aside, "you're representing this family. Don't shame us." Her mother kissed her cheek, pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. "Some peppermint candy," she whispered. "For the journey." Evelyn stood apart, beautiful in her blue wool coat. For a moment, their eyes met. Something flickered in Evelyn's gaze. Guilt, perhaps, or relief. Then she looked away. "All aboard," the driver called. Annie climbed into the coach, squeezing between the minister and a heavy-set woman traveling to visit her daughter. As the coach lurched forward, she looked back once. Her family was already walking away. Only her mother glanced back, raising one hand in farewell. The journey stretched endlessly. They stopped at way stations to change horses, to eat hurried meals of tough beef and harder biscuits. The landscape transformed from familiar farmland to endless prairie, then to rocky, mountainous terrain. Annie's back ached from the constant jostling. Her traveling dress became dusty despite her efforts to keep it clean. The minister, Reverend Palmer, proved kind. He shared news from his newspapers, spoke of the growing towns out west, the opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. The heavy woman, Mrs. Craddock, complained constantly about the dust, the food, the accommodations. "And why are you heading to Wyoming, dear?" Mrs. Craddock asked on the third day, when boredom overcame propriety. "To be married," Annie said quietly. "Oh, how romantic. A sweetheart from back home. A correspondence arrangement." Mrs. Craddock's eyes sharpened with interest. "A mail-order bride. My dear, how brave. Or desperate." She laughed at her own joke. Annie turned to watch the landscape roll by. Brave or desperate, perhaps both, perhaps neither. She was simply Annie McAllister, sent to fulfill her sister's obligation, carrying the weight of family honor on her shoulders. The mountains grew closer, stark and beautiful against the endless sky. Somewhere in their shadow waited Jesse Hartland, expecting a golden-haired beauty who wrote sweet letters and promised to make his house a home. Instead, he would get Annie plain, honest Annie, who knew more about plowing than poetry, more about preserving than prettiness. She touched the letters in her coat pocket. When she met him, she would tell the truth immediately. It was the only honorable thing to do. He could send her back if he wished, though what she would face at home after such humiliation, she couldn't bear to imagine. The coach rolled on, carrying her toward an uncertain future. The Wyoming wind howled outside, wild and free, and Annie closed her eyes, trying to gather courage from its strength. Whatever waited in the territory capital, whatever Jesse Hartland decided when he saw her, she would face it with the same steadiness that had carried her through 24 years of being second best. The sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Tomorrow, they would reach the station. Tomorrow, her new life, whatever it might be, would begin. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weather-beaten station building in Cheyenne. Annie's hands trembled as she gathered her traveling bag, her legs stiff from days of continuous travel. Through the dust-covered window, she could see several people waiting on the platform. Ranchers in worn denim, merchants in pressed suits, and women clutching children's hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she searched for him. Jesse Hartland. In his letters, he'd described himself simply, tall, dark hair, would be wearing his good black hat. But half the men on the platform fit that description. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down. Annie accepted his help descending from the coach, her worn boots hitting the packed dirt with a soft thud. The Wyoming wind immediately caught at her bonnet, threatening to tear it from her head. She clutched her small trunk as the driver unloaded it from the boot, her mouth dry as prairie dust. "Miss McAllister?" The deep voice made her turn. The man standing before her was indeed tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his clean but faded shirt. Dark hair showed beneath his black hat, and his face was angular, weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as winter sky, serious, searching. This was Jesse Hartland, and he was looking at her with barely concealed confusion. Annie swallowed hard, squaring her shoulders. She'd promised herself she would tell the truth immediately. "Mr. Hartland, I'm Annie McAllister, Evelyn's sister." His brow furrowed. "Sister? Yes, There's something I must tell you right away. Evelyn couldn't come. She changed her mind about the marriage. My father sent me in her place." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I know this isn't what you expected, and I understand if you want to send me back on the next coach. I have enough money for—" "She's not coming." It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, unreadable. Annie shook her head, shame burning her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I told them it wasn't right, but you came instead. My father insisted, but I won't hold you to anything. You are expecting Evelyn, and I'm not her." Jesse studied her for a long moment. Annie forced herself to stand still under his scrutiny, though she wanted desperately to smooth her travel-worn dress or tuck away the strands of brown hair that had escaped her bonnet. She knew what he saw. A plain woman with work-roughened hands and sun-touched skin, nothing like the golden beauty in the photograph. "You traveled 5 days alone?" he asked finally. "Yes. Through territory that's still half wild, where Indians and outlaws might cause trouble." The coach was well guarded. "To marry a man you've never met? A man who wasn't even writing to you?" Annie lifted her chin. "To honor my family's obligation, and to tell you the truth, so you could choose." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a slight softening around his eyes. "I see." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "My wagon's this way. But don't you want to—" "It's near dark. There won't be another coach for 3 days. You'll come to the ranch tonight. We can sort this out tomorrow." Annie followed him to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 draft horses. He helped her up onto the bench seat with impersonal courtesy, his hands strong but careful. As he walked around to climb up on the driver's side, Annie caught sight of other men watching from the platform, their expressions ranging from curiosity to appreciation. She pulled her shawl tighter, unused to such attention. Jesse released the brake and clicked to the horses. They moved through the town streets as dusk painted everything in shades of purple and gray. Annie glimpsed saloons spilling yellow light and raucous laughter, general stores closing for the evening, a hotel with painted ladies lounging on the balcony. She kept her eyes forward, acutely aware of the silent man beside her. They left town behind, following a rutted road into the growing darkness. Stars began to appear, more stars than Annie had ever seen in Nebraska. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves. "How old are you?" Jesse asked suddenly. 24. Old for an unmarried woman. Annie's cheeks burned. "Yes. Why aren't you married?" The blunt question stung, but Annie appreciated his directness. "I'm not the sort men court, especially when they could court my sister instead." "But you came anyway. To marry a stranger." "I came to tell you the truth. What happens next is your choice." Jesse made a sound that might have been approval or dismissal. They rode on in silence until lights appeared in the distance, the warm glow of windows in the darkness. "That's the ranch," he said. As they drew closer, Annie could make out the shape of buildings. A 2-story house, a large barn, several outbuildings. It was more substantial than she'd expected, speaking of hard work and careful planning. The house itself was simple but well built, with a covered porch across the front and glass windows that must have cost dearly to freight out here. Jesse pulled the wagon up near the porch and came around to help her down. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment, steadying her, before he stepped back. "I'll bring your trunk in. The house isn't much, but it's clean. I hired a woman from town to ready things, expecting—" He didn't finish. Expecting Evelyn. Beautiful Evelyn, who would have graced his home like an ornament. Instead, he got practical Annie, who could probably milk his cows and mend his shirts, but would never turn heads at a social gathering. Jesse lit a lantern and led her inside. The front room was sparse but neat. A stone fireplace, a settee that looked barely used, a rocking chair near the window. Everything spoke of a man living alone, function over comfort. "Kitchen's through there," he gestured. Bedroom upstairs. There's a guest room where you can sleep tonight. Thank you. Annie removed her bonnet, smoothing her disheveled hair. Mr. Hartland, I should say again. You're here, he interrupted. You told me the truth straight off. That counts for something. He set her trunk near the stairs. Are you hungry? There's stew keeping warm. Yes, thank you. In the kitchen, Jesse ladled thick beef stew into a bowl and set it before her with a chunk of bread. He poured coffee from a pot on the stove, then sat across from her at the scarred wooden table. Annie ate carefully, aware of his watchful gaze. Can you cook? He asked abruptly. Yes. Keep house? Tend a garden? Yes. Handle livestock? Birth calves if needed? I was raised on a farm. He nodded slowly. And you can read and write, obviously, though the letters were Evelyn's, Annie finished. I'm sorry for the deception. You didn't deceive me. Your sister did. Your father did. His jaw tightened. But not you. They sat in silence while Annie finished her meal. The stew was good, hearty, and well-seasoned. Either the woman from town was an excellent cook, or Jesse had skills beyond what most bachelor ranchers possessed. I'll show you the guest room, he said when she was done. We'll talk more tomorrow. He carried her trunk upstairs, showing her to a small, clean room with a narrow bed and a washstand. There's water in the pitcher, privy's out back, I rise at dawn. Mr. Hartland, Annie said as he turned to go. What will you decide? About me, I mean? He paused in the doorway, his face half in shadow. I advertised for a wife, Miss McAllister, a partner to share this life. Your sister promised that in her letters, then broke her word. You came here knowing I might reject you, but you came anyway. Told me the truth anyway. He was quiet for a moment. I'll decide based on who you are, not who you aren't. He closed the door, leaving Annie alone with the lantern's flickering light. She sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. Through the window, she could see the vast Wyoming sky, stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. She thought of Evelyn, probably being courted by Samuel Morrison right now, laughing in their parents' warm parlor. Thought of Jesse Hartland's gray eyes, serious and searching. He would decide tomorrow. Tonight she was here, in this strange house on the edge of wilderness, having traded the familiar cage of being second best for the unknown possibilities of a new territory. Annie changed into her nightgown and washed her face with the cool water. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and coyotes calling in the distance, she wondered what morning would bring. Would Jesse send her back? Keep her out of obligation, or might he possibly see something in plain Annie McAllister worth choosing? The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house she heard Jesse's footsteps, steady and sure. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight she had told the truth, and that, as he'd said, counted for something. Dawn came early to the Wyoming territory. Annie woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment she forgot where she was, then reality crashed back. Jesse Hartland's ranch, the guest room, the uncertain future that awaited her downstairs. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a brown calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar routine of pinning up her hair, though she caught herself taking extra care, smoothing the wayward strands that always escaped at her temples. The house was quiet as she descended the stairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jesse already at work in the barn, his tall figure moving with economical grace. Annie surveyed the kitchen. A good stove, adequate supplies, but everything arranged as a man living alone would arrange it. Without thinking, she began to make breakfast. By the time Jesse entered, stamping his boots on the threshold, she had biscuits browning in the oven, bacon sizzling in the pan, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. He stopped short, taking in the scene. You didn't have to. I'm used to being useful, Annie said simply, not turning from the stove. Sit. It's almost ready. Jesse hung his hat on a peg and sat at the table, watching as she moved efficiently around his kitchen. When she set the plate before him, golden biscuits, crisp bacon, eggs fried perfectly. Something flickered in his gray eyes. This is good, he said after the first bite. It's just breakfast. So, it's been a long time since anyone cooked for me like this. He paused. Except Mrs. Henderson from town, and she charges by the hour. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the strained quiet of the night before. Annie found herself studying him covertly, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the careful way he handled his fork and knife, the small scar on his left hand. He was handsome in a severe way, she realized, though lines of hardship marked his face. After breakfast, Jessie pushed back from the table. "I need to speak plain with you, Miss McAllister." Annie's stomach tightened, but she met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate directness. I need a wife, not for decoration or social calls. There's precious little society out here anyway. I need a partner, someone who can handle the work, the isolation, the hard seasons. Someone who won't fold up and blow away when winter winds hit or summer drought burns everything brown." "I understand." "Do you?" His eyes searched hers. "The nearest neighbor is Hattie Rose Fletcher, 8 miles east. Town's a day's ride. In winter we might be cut off for weeks. There's no fancy goods, no socials every week, no family visiting for Sunday dinner." "Mr. Hartland," Annie said quietly, "I've spent my life working. I know isolation, being in a crowded room and still being alone, because no one sees you past your prettier sister. I can work your garden, tend your house, help with stock if needed. I'm not afraid of hard seasons." Jessie was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood. "Come with me." He led her outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch spread before them, the sturdy barn, corrals holding horses and a few milk cows, chickens scratching in the yard. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already crowned with snow, though it was barely autumn. 200 acres, Jessie said. Built it up from nothing after the war. Every fence post, every building, placed with these hands. He flexed his scarred fingers unconsciously. "It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. Ours if—" He stopped. "If you decide to keep me," Annie finished. "If we decide to suit each other," he corrected. "I'm not an easy man, Miss McAllister. The war left its marks. I have moods, dark days. I work from dawn to past dusk. I don't talk much." "I'm not an easy woman," Annie replied. "I speak my mind. I'm plain as a fence post. I can't sing or play piano or do delicate needlework. I'll never be the ornament Evelyn would have been." "I don't need an ornament." His voice was rough. "I need someone real." A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Jessie's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where Annie noticed he wore no gun, though the gesture suggested he once had. The rider resolved into a young man, perhaps 20, with sandy hair and an easy smile. He pulled up in a cloud of dust, touching his hat to Annie. "Morning, Jessie. This the new Mrs. Hartland?" "Miss McAllister," Jessie corrected. "Annie, this is Jonah Cooper. He helps out when I need an extra hand. Pleased to meet you, miss." Jonah's smile widened, his appreciation obvious. "Welcome to Wyoming territory. Jessie here's a lucky man." Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks. It had been years since any man looked at her with such open admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper." "Just Jonah, miss. Everyone calls me Jonah." He turned to Jessie. "Came to tell you that fence in the north pasture's down again. Those ornery steers of Thompson's pushed through." Jessie's jaw tightened. "3rd time this month. Want me to round them up?" "We'll both go. Need to have words with Thompson about keeping his stock on his own land." Jessie glanced at Annie. "I'll be back by midday." "I'll be here," she said simply. She watched them ride off, noting how Jonah kept turning to look back at her. Jessie sat his horse like he was born to it, back straight, moving as one with the animal. Annie turned to survey her temporary domain. If Jessie decided to send her back, at least she could leave things better than she found them. She started with the house, opening windows to air out the bachelor staleness. The main room needed little, just dust removed and furniture rearranged to catch the morning light. She found Jessie's bedroom upstairs, as sparse as a monk's cell. The bed was made with military precision, a Bible on the nightstand, the only personal touch. In a trunk at the foot of the bed, she discovered a Union uniform, carefully folded, and beneath it, letters tied with string. Annie didn't read them. They weren't hers to read, but she noticed they were addressed to Sergeant Jessie Hartland. And the newest was dated 1865. By the time she heard horses approaching, Annie had bread rising, beans soaking for supper, and had beaten the parlor rug clean. She was in the garden, assessing what could be salvaged from Jessie's attempt at vegetables, when a woman's voice called out, "Hello there, you must be the bride." The woman climbing down from a rickety wagon was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a face weathered to leather. She wore men's trousers under her skirt and boots that had seen better decades. Her smile was warm as summer sunshine. "I'm Hattie Rose Fletcher, your nearest neighbor. Came to see if Jesse finally got himself hitched." "Annie McAllister," Annie replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "And not hitched yet. It's complicated. Honey, everything about Jesse Hartland is complicated." Hattie Rose's eyes were shrewd but kind. "Come on, let's have some coffee and you can tell me all about it. That man needs a woman's perspective and he surely won't ask for it." Soon they were seated at the kitchen table, the coffee pot between them. Annie found herself telling the whole story. Evelyn, the substitution, Jesse's reserved reaction. "So you're not the pretty sister," Hattie Rose said bluntly. "Good. Pretty would last about one winter out here before hightailing it back to civilization. You, though." She studied Annie with experienced eyes. "You've got staying power. I can tell. He might still send me back. Maybe. But I saw how that boy Jonah looked at you. Jesse saw it too. Nothing like a little competition to clarify a man's thinking." "There's no competition. Mr. Hartland doesn't know what he wants yet," Hattie Rose interrupted. "Men are like that sometimes, too caught up in what they expected to see what's right in front of them." She stood to leave. "Word of advice, don't try to be your sister, be yourself. Jesse Hartland's got no use for pretense." After Hattie Rose left, Annie continued working. She found satisfaction in bringing order to the house, in coaxing life from the neglected garden. When Jesse returned near sunset, he found her hauling water to the struggling tomato plants. "Let me," he said, taking the bucket from her hands. Together they watered the garden as the sky painted itself in shades of pink and gold. Jesse worked beside her in comfortable silence, following her lead on which plants to save and which to pull. "Jonah asked to come to supper," he said as they finished. "That all right?" Annie heard what he wasn't saying, that Jonah was interested, that this was a test of sorts. "Of course, there's plenty." Supper was a lively affair with Jonah there. He talked enough for all three of them, telling stories of ranch life, asking Annie about Nebraska, complimenting everything from the beans to how she'd arranged the flowers on the table. Wildflowers Jesse hadn't even noticed she'd picked. Jesse grew quieter as the meal progressed, his gray eyes moving between Annie and Jonah. When Jonah offered to help with dishes, Jesse intervened. "Getting late. Best head home before full dark." Jonah grinned, unperturbed. "Right you are. Miss Annie, pleasure dining with you. Hope to do it again soon." After he left, Annie and Jesse cleaned up in silence. As she washed and he dried, Annie felt the weight of decision hanging between them. "He's a good man," Jesse said finally. "Young, enthusiastic, has his own place starting up. He'd court you proper if you send me back?" Annie's hand stilled in the soapy water. "Is that what you've decided?" Jesse set down the plate he was drying, turning to face her. In the lamplight, his face was all shadows and angles. "I haven't decided anything, except this house already feels different with you in it, one day, and it feels alive." Annie's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "Houses need tending, like gardens, like everything else out here." "Yes," Jesse agreed quietly. "They do." He said nothing more, but Annie felt something shift between them. Not a decision made, but a possibility acknowledged. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she had a place here, temporary though it might be. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and careful distance. Annie rose each dawn to cook breakfast. Jesse ate in appreciative silence, then disappeared into the endless tasks of ranch life. She kept house, tended the garden, mended his clothes without being asked. They moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps but never touched. The evening Annie found the letters changed everything. She was cleaning the small desk in the parlor when the drawer stuck. Wrestling with it, She jarred loose a bundle of papers that scattered across the floor. As she gathered them, she realized they were Jesse's letters to Evelyn, the ones he'd never sent, rough drafts crossed out and rewritten. She shouldn't read them. They weren't meant for her, but her eyes caught on her sister's name, and she was lost. "Dear Miss McAllister," one began, the handwriting less controlled than in the letters Evelyn had received. "I am not good with words. The war took many things from me, including the ease of speaking to people, especially women. But I will try to tell you true." Annie sank into the chair, reading despite herself. The letters revealed a different Jesse, one who struggled to express the loneliness that ate at him, who wrote of nightmares that woke him sweating in the darkness, who longed for someone to share not just his work, but his silences. "The land out here takes more than it gives," he'd written in one draft. "It takes sweat, blood, sometimes hope itself. But when it gives back, when the sun sets over the mountains and the world turns gold, when a new calf stands on shaky legs, when rain finally comes after drought, it's worth holding on to. I need someone who understands that, someone who can find beauty in harsh places." Annie's throat tightened. These weren't the carefully proper letters Evelyn had shown her. These were the words of a man trying desperately to connect across miles of distance, revealing more than he probably intended. "What are you doing?" She jumped, scattering the pages. Jesse stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the fading light. "I'm sorry," Annie stammered, gathering the letters with shaking hands. "The drawer stuck and they fell out. I shouldn't have read them." He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking the papers from her hands. For a moment, she thought he would rage at her for the invasion of privacy. Instead, he stood holding the letters, looking down at them with something like bewilderment. "I wrote these before sending the proper ones," he said quietly. "Couldn't figure out how to say what I meant without sounding like a fool." "You don't sound like a fool." Annie's voice was barely above a whisper. "You sound like a man who understands what matters." Jesse looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The sunset light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the lines that pain had carved around his eyes. "Do you want to see it?" he asked abruptly. "See what?" "What I wrote about. The sunset from the ridge. It's something I wanted to share with." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Will you come?" Annie nodded, not trusting her voice. Jesse grabbed his jacket and handed her a shawl, then led her out to the horses. He saddled her mount with quick, efficient movements, then helped her up. His hands lingered at her waist for just a moment, warm through the fabric of her dress. They rode in silence up a winding trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. Annie had become a competent rider in her 2 weeks at the ranch, and Jesse seemed to approve of how she handled the mare. The air grew cooler as they climbed, scented with pine and sage. Finally, Jesse reined in at a wide ledge that overlooked the entire valley. The view stole Annie's breath. The ranch spread below them like a child's toy, the buildings tiny squares in the vast landscape. Beyond stretched miles of grassland, and beyond that, the mountains rose in layers of blue and purple. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and crimson. "Oh," Annie breathed. Jesse dismounted and helped her down, then stood beside her as they watched the light change. "I come here when the world gets too heavy," he said quietly. "During the war, I'd remember this place. Kept me sane sometimes, knowing it was here waiting." "It's beautiful. Beautiful and terrible," Jesse agreed. "Like most things worth having." He glanced at her. "Your sister would have hated it." Annie turned to face him. "How do you know?" Her letters, full of parties and social calls, new dresses and gossip from town. She wrote about people, never about land or weather or the way morning light changes with the seasons. He paused. "I convinced myself it didn't matter, that a pretty wife would make the loneliness bearable. But standing here now—" "What?" Annie prompted when he fell silent. "I think I was writing to the wrong sister." The words hung between them like morning mist. Annie's heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, to wait. "I'm not an easy man," Jesse continued, his eyes on the horizon. "I have dark moods, memories that won't stay buried. Some nights I wake up still smelling gunpowder and blood. I work myself to exhaustion trying to outrun ghosts. I'm not good with words or gentle touches. I don't know how to court a woman proper. I don't need courting, Annie said softly. What do you need? She thought carefully before answering. Truth. Work that matters. Someone who sees me as I am, not as a pale shadow of my sister. A place to belong that I've earned, not been given out of pity or obligation. Jesse turned to her then, his gray eyes intense. You've been here 2 weeks. The house runs smooth as clockwork. The garden's coming back to life. You handle Hattie Rose's nosy questions with grace and Jonah's mooning with kindness. You work from dawn to dusk without complaint. You've read my foolish letters and didn't laugh. They weren't foolish. Annie? Her name on his lips was rough, uncertain. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer true. Could you make a life here? Not because your father sent you or family honor demands it, but because you choose it. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky ablaze with final light. In the distance, a hawk cried, wheeling on the wind. Annie looked at this hard, lonely man who'd built something from nothing, who carried wounds that might never fully heal, who'd brought her to share his sacred place. I've been choosing it every day, she said. Every meal I cook, every shirt I mend, every morning I wake up and start again. I'm not here for my father or my family's honor. I'm here because... She took a breath. Because this feels like where I'm meant to be. Jesse's hand found hers, calloused and warm. I can't promise easy, I can't promise gentle, but I can promise truth, partnership, respect. Maybe, in time. He stopped. Maybe is enough, Annie said. Maybe is a beginning. They stood together as the last light faded, hands linked, watching the stars emerge one by one. The land spread before them, harsh and beautiful, demanding and giving. It would take everything they had and ask for more. But standing there with Jesse's solid presence beside her, Annie felt something she hadn't expected. Not just acceptance or resignation, but possibility. We should head back, Jesse said finally. Temperature drops fast once the sun's gone. But he didn't release her hand immediately, and Annie didn't pull away. For just a moment more, they stood at the edge of the world, two people who'd found each other through misdirection and honesty, through letters meant for someone else and truths meant for each other. The ride back was quiet, but it was a different silence than before. Not the careful distance of strangers, but the companionable quiet of two people who'd reached an understanding. As they unsaddled the horses in the barn, working by lantern light, Annie felt the shift in their rhythm. Still careful, still learning, but moving together now rather than around each other. Annie? Jesse said as they walked to the house. Tomorrow I'll ride to town. See the preacher about what comes next. If you're certain. I'm certain. He nodded, and she saw the ghost of what might have been a smile touch his lips. Then I'll go. That night, Annie lay in the narrow bed of the guest room, knowing it would be one of her last nights there. Soon she would move to the room down the hall, to the bed with its military corners and lonely Bible. She would take on not just the work of being a rancher's wife, but the harder task of being Jesse's wife. Learning his silences, weathering his storms, building something real from the ashes of misdirected letters. It wouldn't be the romance Evelyn had dreamed of, but it would be true, and it would be theirs, and maybe that was worth more than all the pretty promises in the world. The storm came 3 days after Jesse rode to town to speak with the preacher. Annie woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the valley like artillery fire and the urgent lowing of cattle in distress. Through her window, she could see Jesse already moving across the yard, his slicker whipping in the wind as he headed for the barn. She dressed quickly, pulling on her sturdiest dress and the old boots Jesse had found for her. By the time she reached the kitchen, rain was hammering against the windows with violent force. Through the chaos, she could barely make out Jesse and Jonah, who must have ridden over at first light, struggling with something near the barn. Annie grabbed her shawl and plunged into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down, rain soaking through her clothes instantly. She fought her way to the barn where Jesse was trying to calm a panicked mare. "Get back to the house," he shouted over the storm. "What's wrong?" "Fence down in the east pasture. Cattle scattered. One of the calves—" Thunder drowned his words, but Annie saw Jonah pointing toward the creek. Her heart sank. The creek that was usually a gentle trickle would be a raging torrent in this rain. If a calf was caught there, "I'll help," she shouted back. Jessie's face was a mask of rain and frustration. "It's too dangerous. I grew up with storms," Annie interrupted. "Tell me what to do." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then lightning illuminated his face, and she saw him make a decision. "Stay with Jonah. Help him get the herd back to the near pasture. I'll go after the calf." He was gone before she could protest, disappearing into the gray sheets of rain. Jonah appeared at her elbow, water streaming from his hat. "This way, Miss Annie. We need to turn them before they reach the bluff." What followed was a battle against nature itself. Annie had worked cattle before, but never in conditions like these. The rain turned the ground to treacherous mud. The cattle, normally docile, were wild with fear. She and Jonah fought to turn them, using their horses and sheer determination to guide the panicked animals away from danger. Through it all, Annie's thoughts kept turning to Jessie, out there alone in the storm. The creek would be deadly now, its banks crumbling, water the color of chocolate racing with debris. One slip, one moment's inattention. "There," Jonah pointed. The last of the cattle were moving toward safety. "We got them. Where's Jessie?" Annie was already turning her horse. "The creek. He went after a calf." "Damn fool," Jonah muttered, but there was admiration in it. "That's Jessie for you. Won't lose a single head if he can help it." They rode hard toward the creek, the storm beginning to show signs of weakening. The rain still fell, but the thunder was moving east, and gaps appeared in the clouds. As they crested a rise, Annie saw him. Jessie was in the creek, waist deep in the rushing water, struggling with something. The calf, she could see it now, trapped against a fallen log, bawling in terror. Jessie was trying to free it, but the current kept threatening to sweep him downstream. "Jessie!" Annie screamed, but the wind tore the word away. She slid from her horse before Jonah could stop her, slipping and sliding down the muddy bank. The water was shockingly cold, the current stronger than she'd imagined. But Jessie was there, fighting alone, and she couldn't just watch. "Annie, no!" Jessie saw her coming, his face a mix of anger and fear. "Get back!" Instead, she waded deeper, grabbing onto a sturdy root to anchor herself. "Together!" she shouted. "We do it together!" For a heartbeat, he stared at her, soaked, muddy, stubborn Annie McAllister, who wouldn't leave him to fight alone. Then he nodded, and together they worked to free the terrified calf. It happened fast. The log shifted, the calf pulled free, and the current caught Jessie off balance. Annie saw him go under, the brown water closing over his head, and her heart stopped. "Jessie!" She lunged forward, her hand finding his shirt, hauling with strength born of desperation. Jonah was there suddenly, having made it down the bank, adding his strength to hers. Together they dragged Jessie to shallow water, all of them gasping, the calf somehow scrambling to safety on its own. Jessie coughed up water, his face pale beneath the mud. "Damn fool thing to do," he gasped, and Annie didn't know if he meant his actions or hers. "Yes," she agreed, still gripping his shirt. "It was." They staggered back to the house, Jonah supporting Jessie on one side, Annie on the other. The storm was passing, leaving destruction in its wake. Fences down, the garden Annie had worked so hard on half washed away, debris scattered everywhere. But they were alive. In the kitchen, Annie stoked the fire while Jessie and Jonah stripped off their soaked outer clothes. She set water to heat, pulled out towels, moved with the efficiency of someone who'd weathered crises before. But her hands shook as she poured coffee, remembering that moment when the water closed over Jessie's head. "You could have been killed," Jessie said quietly. He sat at the table, a blanket around his shoulders, studying her with those serious gray eyes. "That current could have taken you." "It could have taken you," Annie countered, bringing him the coffee. "Did you think I'd just stand on the bank and watch? Most women would have. I'm not most women." "No," Jessie agreed, something warm flickering in his gaze. "You're not." Jonah cleared his throat. "Well, I'd best check on the rest of the stock. Make sure we didn't lose any others in the storm." He grabbed his still-soaked hat, nodding to them both. "Glad you're all right, Jessie." "Miss Annie, that was brave. Foolish, but brave." After he left, Annie and Jessie sat in silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the gentler rain still pattering on the roof. Annie became aware of her appearance. Dress muddy and clinging, hair hanging in wet ropes, face probably streaked with dirt. Not exactly the picture of a proper bride-to-be. "I spoke to Reverend Morrison," Jessie said suddenly. Annie's heart jumped. "Oh? He can marry us Saturday, if—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "If you still want to. After seeing what life here can be like, storms and danger and calves that need saving even when it's foolish to try." Annie moved to sit across from him, reaching out to cover his cold hand with hers. "Jessie, I didn't wade into that creek because I had to. I did it because—" She took a breath. "Because you were in trouble, and I couldn't bear to lose you, not when we've just found each other." His hand turned under hers, fingers interlacing. "I'm not good at saying things, but when I saw you coming down that bank, terrified and determined and not backing down, I knew." "Knew what?" "That I'd written to the wrong sister, like I said, but maybe that was the only way to find the right one." Annie felt tears prick her eyes, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. "So Saturday? If you're willing. It won't be fancy. Just us, the preacher, Hattie Rose, and maybe Jonah as witnesses." "I don't need fancy," Annie said. "I just need true." Jessie squeezed her hand, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled. A real smile that transformed his stern features. "Then Saturday it is." They spent the rest of the day working side by side, repairing what the storm had damaged. The garden was a loss, but Annie was already planning where to replant. The fences would need days of work, but they could be fixed. As the sun broke through the clouds near evening, painting the wet world in gold, Annie felt a deep contentment despite the destruction. That night, as she prepared for bed, Annie found Jessie on the porch, staring out at the land. "Can't sleep?" she asked, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cool air. "Thinking," he replied, "about storms and choices and letters that go astray." Annie moved to stand beside him. "Any regrets?" He was quiet for a long moment. "My only regret," he said finally, "is that you had to come here believing you were second choice. You weren't, Annie. Maybe you were second sent, but you were first chosen. Does that make sense?" "It does," Annie whispered, and it did. In the strange arithmetic of the heart, sometimes the indirect path led most truly home. They stood together watching the stars emerge, the storm-washed sky clearer than glass. In 3 days, she would be Annie Hartland, rancher's wife, partner in this hard and beautiful life. It wasn't the fairy tale Evelyn had dreamed of, but it was real and solid, and theirs. And that, Annie thought as Jessie's hand found hers in the darkness, was worth more than all the pretty dreams in the world. The letter arrived the morning of Annie's wedding day. She was in the kitchen pressing her best dress, a simple gray wool that Hattie Rose had helped her alter to fit properly when Jessie came in from the morning chores. His face was unreadable as he held out the envelope. "It's from Nebraska," he said quietly. "Your sister's handwriting." Annie's hand stilled on the iron. She stared at the letter as if it were a rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike. Of course, Evelyn would write now, when Annie had finally found her footing, finally begun to believe in the life she was building. "Do you want to read it alone?" Jessie asked. Annie set down the iron with careful precision. "No. Whatever she has to say, you should hear it too." Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Evelyn's flowery script sprawled across the page, as decorative and insubstantial as lace. "Dearest Annie," she read aloud, "I hope this letter finds you well, though I confess I worry constantly about your situation. How you must be suffering, exiled to that desolate place because of Father's stubbornness. I write with wonderful news. Samuel Morrison has released me from our understanding. He found my sacrifice in sending you away too painful to bear, knowing how I must pine for the life I was meant to have." Jessie made a sound that might have been disgust. Annie continued reading, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I have convinced Father that the whole arrangement was a terrible mistake. Mr. Hartland surely sees by now that you cannot possibly fulfill the role of a proper rancher's wife. You were always more suited to simpler tasks. I am certain he must miss the connection we formed through our letters. The meeting of minds and hearts that mere physical presence cannot replace. Annie's hands tightened on the paper. She goes on, she said tightly. Listen to this. I am prepared to honor my original commitment. Mr. Hartland need only send word, and I will come immediately to take my rightful place. You, dear sister, can return home where you belong. Father has agreed to this solution. After all, Mr. Hartland deserves the bride he was promised, not a pale substitute. Do not think of this as failure, Annie. Some of us are meant for grander stages, and there is no shame in acknowledging one's limitations. She set the letter on the table, smoothing it with hands that wanted to crumple it instead. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of cattle. She's wrong, Jesse said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Is she? Annie heard the bitterness creep into her voice. She's beautiful, accomplished, everything you thought you were getting when… She's wrong, Jesse repeated more firmly. He moved around the table, taking Annie's shoulders in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Annie, I need you to hear this. Really hear it. Annie looked up at him, seeing her own reflection in his gray eyes. Plain, practical Annie, with her work-worn hands and weather-touched skin. Your sister writes pretty letters, Jesse said slowly. But that's all they were, pretty words on paper, meaning nothing. She wrote about parties I'd never attend, people I'd never meet, a life that has nothing to do with this place. I was lonely enough to think that didn't matter, fool enough to believe beauty could survive out here without substance behind it. His hands tightened on her shoulders. You came here expecting rejection, but you worked anyway. You saw what needed doing and did it without being asked. You stood in a storm beside me, risked your life for a calf that wasn't even yours yet. You've made this house a home in ways I didn't even know it was lacking. But she's selfish, Jesse interrupted, something like anger flashing in his eyes. She broke her word, sent you in her place like you were worth less, and now wants to sweep in and claim what she threw away because her other option failed. That's not beauty, Annie. That's ugliness dressed in silk. Annie felt tears burn her eyes. I've spent my whole life being second to her. Then stop, Jesse said simply. You're not second here. You're not a substitute or a replacement. You're Annie, and you're who I choose. Today, tomorrow, and every day after. He reached past her to pick up the letter, his jaw tight. What do you want to do with this? Annie looked at the letter, at Evelyn's careless words that even now had the power to wound. Then she looked at Jesse's face, serious and certain, waiting for her decision. Burn it, she said quietly. After the wedding, we'll burn it together. Something shifted in Jesse's expression, pride, perhaps, or relief. Good. Now, I believe Hattie Rose will be here soon to help you get ready. And He paused, a slight flush creeping up his neck. I should probably shave. Despite everything, Annie found herself smiling. That might be wise. Wouldn't want Reverend Morrison to think I'm marrying a mountain man. Jessie touched her cheek, a gesture so gentle it made her heart ache. 3 hours, Annie. 3 hours and it's done, legal and binding and permanent. Your sister can write all the letters she wants after that. He left to prepare, and Annie returned to pressing her dress, but her mind kept circling back to Evelyn's words. Pale substitute. Cannot possibly fulfill the role. Some of us are meant for grander stages. You all right, honey? Hattie Rose's voice from the doorway made Annie jump. The older woman entered, carrying a small basket and wearing her best dress, a deep blue that had seen better years but was clean and neat. I'm fine, Annie said automatically. Uh-huh. Hattie Rose set down her basket and picked up Evelyn's letter from the table, scanning it quickly. Her expression darkened with each line. That little witch. On your wedding day, no less. She's not wrong about some things, Annie said quietly. I'm not what Jesse thought he was getting. I'm not… Stop right there. Hattie Rose's voice was sharp. I've known Jesse Hartland since he came back from the war, broken and half dead inside. I've watched him build this place board by board, trying to outwork his demons. And I've watched you these past weeks. She moved closer, taking Annie's hands. You know what I see? I see a man who smiles now when he didn't before. I see a house that feels lived in instead of just occupied. I see a woman who doesn't just endure this life but embraces it. Your sister couldn't last a week out here, pretty or not. But the letters were lies, Hattie Rose said bluntly. Maybe she didn't mean them to be, but they were. She painted a picture of someone who doesn't exist, some fantasy wife who could somehow be delicate and decorative while surviving frontier life. You, though, you're real. And real is what Jessie needs. She opened her basket, pulling out a small bundle. Now enough of this nonsense. I brought you something. Annie unfolded the cloth to find a delicate hair comb, silver with tiny pearl insets. It was beautiful, finer than anything she owned. It was my mother's, Hattie Rose said gruffly. Wore it at her own wedding 50 years ago. Thought you might like something pretty for today. Something that's yours, not your sister's cast-offs or shadows. Annie's throat tightened. Hattie Rose, I couldn't. You can and you will. Now let's get you ready. Jessie's already nervous enough without keeping him waiting. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Hattie Rose proved surprisingly adept with hair, coiling Annie's brown locks into an elegant style that made the most of the silver comb. The gray dress, freshly pressed, looked better than Annie remembered. When she looked in the small mirror, she saw not Evelyn's pale shadow, but herself, Annie McAllister, soon to be Annie Hartland. Beautiful, Hattie Rose declared, stepping back to admire her work. I'm not beautiful, Hattie Rose repeated firmly. Not like your sister, all flash and surface. Beautiful like this land, honest and strong and enduring. That's worth more than pretty any day. A knock at the door made them both turn. Jonah's voice called out, Ladies, Jessie sent me to see if you're ready. He's wearing a hole in the church floor with his pacing. Annie took a deep breath, smoothing her skirt one last time. In the pocket of her dress, she could feel the weight of Evelyn's letter, waiting to be burned. But that was for later. Now, there was a man waiting for her, a good man who saw her truly and chose her anyway. I'm ready, she called back, and found that she meant it. The church was small, barely more than a chapel, but someone, probably Hattie Rose, had placed wildflowers in mason jars along the aisle. Jessie stood at the front with Reverend Morrison, and when he turned to watch her enter, the look on his face stopped her heart. He was wearing his best shirt, freshly shaved, his dark hair carefully combed, but it was his expression that caught her wonder and certainty mixed with something that might have been love, given time to grow. Annie walked toward him, leaving Evelyn's words behind with each step. This was her choice, her life, her future. Not second best, not a pale substitute, but exactly where she was meant to be. When Jessie took her hands at the altar, they were steady and sure, and Annie knew with bone-deep certainty that she was home. The drought began in May, 3 months after the wedding. At first it seemed like nothing more than a dry spell, the spring rains tapering off earlier than usual, the grass browning at the edges. But as June crawled by without a drop of moisture, and July arrived with skies of brass and a sun that scorched everything it touched, even the old-timers began to worry. Annie stood at the kitchen window, watching dust devils dance across what used to be the vegetable garden. The plants she'd so carefully tended had withered despite her efforts to haul water from the increasingly shallow well. Her hands, already work-worn, were now cracked and bleeding from the constant battle against the dry earth. We'll have to sell some cattle, Jessie said from behind her. He'd come in quietly, a new habit as the drought wore on both their nerves. Can't water them all with what we've got. Annie turned to face him. The past months had carved new lines in his face, and his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. How many? 20 head, maybe 30. Take them to market next week before they lose more weight. He rubbed his face with one dusty hand. It'll set us back years. We'll build back up, Annie said firmly. When the rains come, if they come. The words were bitter, exhausted. Annie moved to him, placing her hand on his arm. They'll come. This land has survived droughts before. We'll survive too. Jessie covered her hand with his, and for a moment they stood together, drawing strength from each other. Then he straightened, becoming the practical rancher again. I'll ride to town tomorrow, see about selling. Maybe pick up what supplies we can afford. I'll come with you, Annie said. It's a hard ride in this heat. I'll come with you, she repeated. They'd learned, these past months, not to waste energy arguing about such things. Partnership meant sharing the burdens, all of them. The ride to town the next morning was grueling. The sun was already fierce by 7 o'clock, and dust rose in clouds from the horses' hooves. Annie had wrapped a damp cloth around her neck, but it dried within minutes. The landscape that had seemed so alive when she first arrived was now painted in shades of brown and gray, as if the color had been burned out of it. Town was suffering too. The small businesses looked pinched and desperate, their windows dusty, their proprietors standing in doorways with worried expressions. At the general store, Annie noticed prices had risen sharply while portions had shrunk. Mrs. Heartland, the shopkeeper, Mr. Briggs, greeted her with a nod. His eyes flicked over her faded dress, the careful mending at the cuffs. "What can I do for you today?" Annie handed over her modest list: flour, salt, coffee, the barest essentials. As Mr. Briggs gathered the items, she heard whispers from the other women in the store. "Married the wrong sister, they say. Mail-order bride that wasn't even meant for him. She's plain as a fence post, but I suppose in a drought year." Annie kept her chin high, focusing on counting out coins from her small purse. But the words stung, especially now when she felt ground down by worry and work. "Don't mind them," a voice said quietly beside her. Annie turned to find Mrs. Morrison, the Reverend's wife, a kind-faced woman who'd always treated her cordially. But today there was something else in her expression. Pity, perhaps. "I don't," Annie lied. "It must be difficult," Mrs. Morrison continued, lowering her voice, "knowing he was expecting someone else, someone more suited to society. I'm sure your sister was very beautiful." The words, though spoken with apparent sympathy, cut deep. Annie felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. "My husband chose me, Mrs. Morrison, not my sister. Me." "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to imply. It's just that in these hard times, a man needs beauty to come home to, something to lift his spirits. And you're so practical." Before Annie could respond, a familiar voice cut through the store's musty air. "My wife is exactly what I need." Jesse stood in the doorway, his face like thunder. He'd clearly heard at least part of the conversation, and his gray eyes were cold as winter stone. "Mr. Heartland," Mrs. Morrison stammered. I heard what you were doing." Jesse moved to Annie's side, his presence solid and protective. "My wife works harder than any 3 women in this town. She's kept our ranch running through this drought while others have given up. She's tended sick cattle, mended fences, hauled water until her hands bled. And she's done it without complaint, without running back to an easier life." He looked around the store, meeting the eyes of everyone present. "You want to know what I chose? I chose strength over beauty, substance over show. I chose a partner who stands beside me in the worst of times, not an ornament who'd wilt at the first sign of hardship. I chose Annie, and I'd choose her again every day for the rest of my life." The silence in the store was absolute. Annie felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was no place for weakness. "Furthermore," Jesse continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led soldiers in battle, "and anyone who suggests my wife is somehow second best or a poor substitute is welcome to say it to my face. Outside, right now." No one moved. "That's what I thought." He turned to Mr. Briggs. "Add a pound of sugar to that order, and that bolt of blue calico my wife was eyeing last month." "Jesse, we can't afford—" Annie began. "We can't afford not to remember what we're working for," he said quietly. "For her ears alone. Something beautiful in the midst of all this dust." They left the store with their heads high, but Annie could feel the weight of the stairs following them. As Jesse helped her into the wagon, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the store window. Sun-browned, thin from the hard months, dressed in faded calico that had been mended too many times. Practical, as Mrs. Morrison had said. Not beautiful. "Don't," Jesse said, reading her thoughts as he'd learned to do. "Don't let them make you see yourself through their eyes." "It's hard not to," Annie admitted as they drove out of town. "When everyone thinks, I don't care what everyone thinks." Jesse's hands were tight on the reins. "I care what I know." And I know that when I wake up at 3 in the morning, sick with worry about the ranch, you're there. When the well runs low, you find ways to make the water stretch. He paused, then continued more quietly. When the war memories get bad, you don't ask questions or demand explanations. You just stay. They rode in silence for a while, the heat pressing down on them like a physical weight. Finally, Annie spoke. That was quite a speech back there. I meant every word. I know. She touched his arm lightly. Thank you. Don't thank me for speaking the truth. He glanced at her and she saw a flash of the vulnerability he rarely showed. Annie, this drought will end. The rains will come. The grass will grow again. But even if they didn't, even if we lost everything and had to start over somewhere else, I'd want you with me. Not your sister, not some prettier woman, not anyone else. You. Annie felt her throat tighten. You're sure? Even though... I'm sure. His voice was firm. Are you? Annie thought of all the responses she could give, about duty, about commitment, about making the best of circumstances. But what came out was simpler and truer. Yes, I'm sure. They drove the rest of the way home in companionable silence, the blue calico wrapped carefully to protect it from dust. That evening, as they worked side by side to water the remaining cattle, Annie found herself thinking not of the townspeople's whispers, but of Jesse's words in the store. The drought would test them further in the days to come. They would lose cattle, watch their savings dwindle, work until they could barely stand. But they would do it together, chosen and choosing, practical and real and enduring as the land itself. That night, as they sat on the porch in the marginally cooler air, Jesse took her hand. I'm not good with pretty words, he said. Never have been, but you need to know, you're not second choice, Annie. You're my only choice. The right choice. Annie squeezed his hand, looking out at their drought-stricken land. It would rain again, the grass would grow, and they would still be here together, proving every day that sometimes what looks like second choice to the world is really destiny in disguise. The stars wheeled overhead, bright in the dusty sky, and Annie allowed herself to hope, not just for rain, but for all the years ahead. Chosen and cherished, exactly as she was. The buggy appeared on the horizon just after noon, a black speck against the endless brown of the drought-stricken land. Annie paused in her work, shading her eyes against the merciless sun. They weren't expecting visitors. Few people made social calls in weather like this. As the buggy drew closer, Annie's stomach dropped. She recognized the matched bay horses, the fancy carriage that looked absurdly out of place on the dusty ranch road. Only one person she knew would travel in such style. Jesse, she called, her voice tight. He emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. One look at her face and he was beside her, following her gaze to the approaching vehicle. Is that? Yes. Annie's hands clenched in her apron. It's Evelyn. They stood together, watching as the buggy pulled up in front of the house. The driver, a hired man from town, helped Evelyn descend. She was exactly as Annie remembered. Golden hair perfectly arranged despite the journey, dress of pale pink silk that somehow remained pristine, parasol held at just the right angle to preserve her porcelain complexion. Annie! Evelyn's voice was bright as birdsong, though her blue eyes were calculating as they took in the scene. The drought-withered garden, the paint peeling from the barn, Annie's faded work dress. My dear sister, how rustic you look. Evelyn. Annie kept her voice neutral. This is unexpected. Is it? Evelyn's laugh tinkled like broken glass. Surely you received my letter about visiting, though I suppose mail delivery must be unreliable in such a remote location. There had been no letter, and they all knew it. Jesse moved slightly closer to Annie, a subtle show of support that Evelyn's sharp eyes didn't miss. Mr. Hartland. Evelyn turned the full force of her beauty on him, dropping into a graceful curtsy. How wonderful to finally meet you in person. Your letters painted such a vivid picture. I feel as though I know you already. Mrs. Hartland, Jesse said coolly, emphasizing Annie's married name. Perhaps you should offer your sister some refreshment after her journey. Annie wanted to refuse, to send Evelyn away before she could spread her poison, but the habits of hospitality ran deep. Of course, Please come in, Evelyn. The kitchen that had always seemed comfortable now felt shabby with Evelyn in it. She perched on a chair like an exotic bird, somehow making the simple act of accepting a glass of water look like a performance. I must say, Evelyn began, her eyes roving over the plain furnishings, it's quite cozy, though I imagine you must miss the comforts of civilization. I know I would simply perish without proper society. We have what we need, Annie said evenly. Do you? Evelyn's smile was sharp. Because from what I hear in town, things have been rather difficult. This dreadful drought, cattle dying, barely scraping by. It must be so hard for you, Mr. Hartland, seeing your ranch suffer so. Jessie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Hard times don't last. Hard people do. How poetically you put it. Evelyn smoothed her skirts. Still, I can't help but think how different things might have been if circumstances had been different. You mean if you'd kept your word? Annie found her voice, anger overcoming her usual restraint. If you hadn't sent me in your place like I was something to be discarded? Evelyn's eyes widened in practiced innocence. Annie, dear, I was thinking of your welfare. You seem so resigned to spinsterhood, and I thought this might be your chance for a life of your own. I was trying to help. By lying, by letting Mr. Hartland expect you. But it all worked out, didn't it? Evelyn turned to Jessie, her expression melting into something soft and appealing. Though I must confess, reading those letters, feeling that connection we shared through words, I've wondered if perhaps we were hasty, if perhaps fate meant for us to find another way to each other. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Annie felt something cold settle in her chest, all her worst fears crystallizing in this moment. Here was Evelyn, beautiful even in the midst of drought, offering Jessie everything Annie couldn't beauty, Grace, the woman he'd originally chosen. Jessie pushed off from the doorframe, moving to stand behind Annie's chair. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and steady. Mrs. McAllister, he said, and his voice carried the same steel it had in the general store. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Oh, Evelyn batted her eyelashes. What kind of misunderstanding? You seem to think I made a mistake, that I settled for something less than what I wanted. His hand tightened slightly on Annie's shoulder. You're wrong. Evelyn's smile faltered. But the letters were pretty lies, Jessie interrupted. Every word calculated to present a picture that had nothing to do with reality. You wrote about parties and social calls, fashion and gossip. Not once did you mention if you could birth a calf, mend a fence, stretch a meal to feed unexpected guests, or stand beside a man when the world was burning down around him. Those aren't exactly romantic topics, Evelyn protested. No, they're not, Jessie agreed. They're real life, my life, the life Annie has embraced without complaint or reservation. He moved around the chair to face Evelyn directly. You want to know what I see when I look at my wife? I see a woman who told me the truth from the first moment, even when it might have cost her everything. I see someone who works from dawn to dusk, who faces drought and hardship without flinching. I see beauty that goes deeper than skin, strength that comes from character, not from charm. But, Evelyn started. I'm not finished, Jessie said quietly, and something in his tone made even Evelyn fall silent. You ask if I wonder how things might have been different. I'll tell you. If you'd kept your word, if you'd come instead of Annie, this ranch would be failing. You'd have run home at the first sign of hardship, the first time you broke a nail or got dust in your hair, and I'd have let you go, grateful to be free of a woman who could only love the idea of something, never the reality. He turned back to Annie, his gray eyes soft. What I have instead is a partner, a wife who sees me as I am, scarred by war, hardened by loss, not always easy to live with, and chooses to stay anyway. So no, Mrs. McAllister, I don't wonder. I don't regret. I thank God every day that you broke your word, because it brought me Annie. Annie felt tears blur her vision, but she blinked them back. This wasn't the time for weakness, not with Evelyn watching like a hawk for any advantage. Evelyn's beautiful face had gone hard, all pretense of sweetness dropped. I see. Well, she stood, smoothing her skirts with sharp, angry movements. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Water does find its own level, after all. The shopkeeper's son in town was right. You two deserve each other. Yes, Annie said quietly, finding her voice at last. We do. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You always were disgustingly noble, Annie. Enjoy your drought and your struggling ranch and your... She glanced dismissively at Jesse, scarred soldier. When you're old before your time, worn out from work and worry, remember you could have gone home. I would have taken your place. I am home, Annie said simply. And my place is here. Then you're a fool. Evelyn swept toward the door. Driver, we're leaving. She paused in the doorway, turning back for one last shot. Oh, Annie, Samuel Morrison and I are to be married next month. A spring wedding, with all the finest families attending. I'll be sure to send you an invitation, though I doubt you'll be able to attend. The journey would be so... expensive. Then she was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of her French perfume and the echo of wagon wheels retreating into the distance. Annie and Jesse stood in the kitchen, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Annie spoke. She was right about one thing. Water does find its own level. Jesse moved to her, pulling her into his arms. What do you mean? I mean we match, you and I. Not in the way she meant it, as an insult, but truly match. We're both scarred, both practical, both more interested in truth than pretty pictures. She pulled back to look at him. I never thanked you properly. For what you said. Didn't say it for thanks, Jesse murmured. Said it because it's true. Every word. Annie reached up to touch his face, this good man who saw her truly and loved her anyway. Do you know what I realized, watching her sit there in her silk dress, trying to make us feel small? What? That I wouldn't trade places with her for anything. Not for all the silk dresses and spring weddings in the world, because I have something she'll never have. A real partnership, built on truth and tested by fire. I have you. Jesse's arms tightened around her. Forever, Annie. That's what I promised at our wedding, and that's what I meant. Forever. Outside, the sun continued its relentless assault on the land. The drought would last several more weeks before the rains finally came. But standing in their simple kitchen, holding each other as the dust of Evelyn's departure settled, Annie and Jesse knew they had already weathered the worst storm, the storm of doubt and comparison and what might have been. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Jesse took Annie's hand. No more ghosts, he said quietly. No more wondering if you were second choice. You were my true choice, Annie. My only choice. The one I'll keep choosing every day for the rest of our lives. Annie squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had built this life they shared. Forever, she agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The land stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful and theirs. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more chances to prove that love wasn't found in pretty letters or silk dresses, but in the choice to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. They had chosen each other, not in spite of who they were, but because of it. And that choice, renewed daily in 1,000 small acts of love and partnership, was worth more than all the beauty and wealth in the world. Under the vast Wyoming sky, two hearts beat as one, finally and fully home. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Annie and Jesse's journey. What did you think of their love story? We'd love to hear from you.